Chapter 1. Introduction to Wealth and Legacy. This chapter introduces Jeanne Bécu at the pinnacle of her power as Madame de Berry, the official mistress of King Louis XV, in 1769 at Versailles. Born illegitimate in 1743 to a seamstress in Vaucouleurs, she has achieved the impossible, transforming from a Parisian prostitute into the most influential woman at the French court. The narrative establishes the paradox of her position. She possesses unimaginable wealth, jewels worth kingdoms, and apartments in the world's most magnificent palace, yet owns nothing that cannot be stripped away instantly. Her inheritance is not of blood, but of favor. She has inherited the role of royal mistress from Madame de Pompadour, wielding power through the aging king's affection. The chapter captures the intoxicating luxury of Versailles while revealing the underlying fragility of her position. Court nobles despise her common origins, but seek her influence. The tone is opulent yet ominous, emphasizing the gilded cage she inhabits. Through vivid descriptions of her daily toilette, interactions with Louis XV, and the hostile court atmosphere, we see a woman who has climbed impossibly high, but remains perpetually aware that her entire world depends on one man's continued desire and protection. The morning light streaming through the 17 mirror-arched windows of Versailles' most magnificent gallery caught every facet of the diamond necklace adorning Jeanne's throat. Each stone was worth more than most French citizens would earn in a lifetime. Yet, as she stood awaiting her official presentation to the court, the jewels felt cold against her skin, beautiful chains that both elevated and imprisoned her. At 26, Madame du Barry had achieved what no woman of her origins should have been able to accomplish. Born Jeanne Bécu, the illegitimate daughter of a provincial seamstress, she had clawed her way from the brothels of Paris to become the maîtresse en titre of the King of France. The transformation seemed miraculous, impossible, scandalous, and it was all of these things. Louis XV, now 59 and showing his age, watched from across the hall with undisguised affection. His eyes, still sharp despite the weariness of absolute power, followed her every movement with the devotion of a man who had found unexpected joy in his declining years. For the king, Jeanne represented something precious he had thought lost forever, the ability to feel young, desired, and genuinely cared for rather than merely obeyed. The court assembled around them told a different story. The Duc de Choiseul, the king's powerful foreign minister, regarded Jeanne with barely concealed contempt. The royal family, led by the Dauphin and his young wife Marie Antoinette, viewed her presence as a degradation of the monarchy itself. These nobles, whose bloodline stretched back centuries, could not forgive the flower seller who now outranked them in influence, if not in birth. "Your Majesty honors France with your choice," Jeanne murmured as Louis approached, her curtsy a masterpiece of practiced grace. She had spent months learning the intricate choreography of court etiquette, understanding that every gesture would be scrutinized for evidence of her common origins. "France honors itself by recognizing true beauty," Louis replied, taking her hand. The gesture sent whispers rippling through the assembled courtiers like wind through wheat. Public displays of royal affection were carefully calibrated political statements, and this one declared Jeanne's position unequivocally. The presentation ceremony began with ritualistic precision. The Comtesse de Barne, who had agreed to sponsor Jeanne for a substantial sum, led her through the gauntlet of nobility. Each step echoed in the vast space, the sound seeming to announce both triumph and transgression. Jeanne wore a gown of silver tissue over white silk, designed by the king's own dressmaker, its cost equivalent to a small estate. Yet beneath the magnificent exterior, she remained acutely aware of her precarious position. The wealth surrounding her was staggering. The apartments Louis had given her contained furniture by the finest craftsmen, paintings by masters, porcelain services worth fortunes. Her personal allowance exceeded the budgets of minor kingdoms. She could commission artworks, support artists, influence appointments, and shape policy through pillow talk with the most powerful man in Europe. Yet all of it, every golden thread, every precious stone, every moment of influence, existed entirely at the pleasure of one aging monarch. The king's whore, she heard whispered as she passed a cluster of court ladies. The words, spoken just loudly enough to reach her ears, reminded her that no amount of wealth could purchase acceptance from those who viewed her as a usurper. She had inherited Madame de Pompadour's position, but not her aristocratic birth or intellectual reputation. Where Pompadour had been respected even by her enemies, Jeanne was merely tolerated, and barely that. As the ceremony concluded and the court began to disperse, Jeanne caught sight of herself in one of the great mirrors. The reflection showed a woman of extraordinary beauty, draped in silk and diamonds, surrounded by the most magnificent palace in the world. Yet something in her own eyes revealed the truth she tried to hide: the constant anxiety of someone who had climbed impossibly high and now lived in terror of falling. That evening, alone with Louis in her private apartments, she allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. "Do you ever wonder what would happen if?" she began, then stopped, unable to voice the fear that haunted her nights. "If what, my dear?" Louis asked, though his expression suggested he understood perfectly. "If circumstances changed," she finished quietly. The king's face grew solemn. He was not a naive man. He understood the precariousness of favorites and the brutal efficiency with which courts could eliminate those who had fallen from grace. "Then you would discover what you are truly made of," he said finally. "But until that day comes, you are under my protection, and that protection is absolute." The promise comforted her, but only partially. Protection, like favor, was a gift that could be revoked. As she prepared for bed that night, removing the magnificent jewels that marked her status, Jeanne understood with crystalline clarity that she had built her life on the most unstable foundation imaginable: the affections of a mortal man. The wealth, the power, the luxury that surrounded her were not truly hers. They were loans against an uncertain future, and the terms of repayment remained terrifyingly unclear. Chapter 2: The Rise and the Initial Struggles. This chapter chronicles Jeanne's journey from her early life as an illegitimate child in Vaucouleurs through her transformation into a skilled courtesan in Paris. Born to seamstress Anne Becou in 1743, Jeanne's childhood was marked by poverty and social stigma. At 15, she moved to Paris with her mother, initially selling flowers on street corners while observing the wealthy clientele who would later become her pathway to power. The narrative follows her education at Madame Gourdon's exclusive establishment, where she learned the sophisticated arts of seduction, conversation, and social manipulation necessary to attract wealthy protectors. Her natural intelligence and adaptability set her apart from other courtesans. The chapter explores her first significant relationship with tax farmer Monsieur Lemetz, who provided her with apartments and financial security, marking her initial rise from street vendor to kept woman. However, the emotional burden of her position becomes apparent. She realizes that despite her material comfort, she remains entirely dependent on male desire and approval. The chapter builds tension through her growing awareness that beauty fades and her current position, while comfortable, offers no long-term security. Her restlessness and ambition begin to crystallize into a dangerous plan for greater elevation. Jeanne Becou entered the world during a thunderstorm that seemed to mirror the scandal of her birth. Her mother, Anne Becou, labored alone in a cramped room above a tavern, attended only by a midwife whose discretion could be bought for the price of a bottle of wine. The child's father remained a mystery that would haunt Jeanne throughout her life. Perhaps the monk Jean-Baptiste Gomard de Vaubernier, perhaps an unnamed nobleman, perhaps someone else entirely. In a society obsessed with bloodlines and legitimacy, this absence of paternal identity became her defining characteristic. Anne worked as a seamstress, her needle moving through fabric with desperate precision as she created beauty for women who would never acknowledge her existence. She stitched wedding gowns for legitimate brides and christening robes for children born within marriage, each perfect seam representing hours of labor that barely kept starvation at bay. Their single room was perpetually damp, the walls stained with moisture and the bitter cold of Lorraine winters. Despite the poverty, Jeanne possessed an unusual beauty that drew attention even in childhood. Her golden hair caught sunlight like spun silk, and her features suggested aristocratic blood despite her circumstances. Neighbors whispered about the waste of such beauty on a bastard child, some suggesting she be sent to a convent before her looks caused trouble. Anne taught her daughter essential skills: reading, writing, basic arithmetic, and the crucial ability to speak with proper grammar despite their humble circumstances. But she also imparted harder lessons learned from bitter experience, that beauty could be both blessing and curse, that men's desires created opportunities as well as dangers, and that survival sometimes required compromising principles only the wealthy could afford to maintain. At 15, Jeanne arrived in Paris with her mother, leaving behind provincial judgments for the anonymous chaos of the capital. The city overwhelmed her senses, unwashed bodies mixing with perfume from passing nobles, street vendors calling their wares, carriage wheels clattering on cobblestones. Anne found work with a dressmaker on Rue Saint-Honor, while Jeanne began selling flowers on street corners. Standing for hours with her basket of roses and violets, Jeanne studied the parade of wealth passing before her eyes. She learned to recognize quality in fabric and craftsmanship, to distinguish genuine nobility from wealthy merchants pretending to aristocratic status. Most importantly, she learned to read male desire in their lingering glances and generous payments for simple flowers. One afternoon, wealthy merchant Monsieur Dumonchot stopped to purchase flowers. He assessed Jeanne with calculating eyes, seeing not just beauty, but potential profit. "You are wasted on this street corner," he said quietly. "A girl with your looks could have a much more comfortable life." Jeanne understood the offer and its implications. The choice represented her first real decision: continue selling flowers for pennies, or sell something else for gold. After a moment's consideration, she met his gaze directly. "Then, show me this comfortable life," she replied. Madame Gourdon's house on Rue de Duport looked respectable from the outside, its heavy curtains concealing the transactions within. Inside, Aubusson carpets and gilt mirrors created an atmosphere of refinement rather than vulgar commerce. Madame Gourdon herself, perhaps 50 with faded beauty but sharp business acumen, examined Jeanne like a jeweler assessing an unpolished gem. "She has potential," the madame announced after her inspection. "The face is extraordinary, the figure excellent, but she moves like a peasant and speaks with a provincial accent." The transformation began immediately. Jeanne was scrubbed, perfumed, and dressed in elegant gowns that revealed her figure. A dancing master taught her graceful movement, while tutors corrected her pronunciation and expanded her vocabulary. She learned to discuss art, music, and literature with enough knowledge to seem cultured without threatening male superiority. Madame Gourdon provided the most crucial lessons in reading male character, creating the illusion of genuine desire, and protecting oneself from disease and unwanted pregnancy. "Men come here seeking fantasy," she explained. "They want to believe you desire them, that this transaction is somehow different from all the others. Your job is to create and maintain that illusion." Jeanne proved an exceptional student, possessing natural gifts for performance and adaptation. She could become whatever the situation required, innocent girl or experienced woman, depending on her client's needs. She learned to laugh at tedious jokes, listen to boring stories with apparent fascination, and make each client feel somehow special. After a year under Madame Gourdon's tutelage, Jeanne caught the attention of Jean-Baptiste de Berry, who specialized in transforming beautiful women into courtesans for wealthy men. He recognized something beyond physical beauty in Jean: intelligence, adaptability, and chameleon-like ability to move between social contexts. Through Dubarry's arrangement, she met Monsieur Lametz, a wealthy tax farmer seeking a new mistress. The introduction occurred at a carefully staged dinner, where Jean appeared as a woman of quality fallen on temporary difficulties rather than a prostitute seeking a protector. Lametz was immediately captivated. Within a week, he had established Jean in comfortable apartments, providing an allowance, servants, and access to dressmakers and jewelers. At 19, she had achieved security her mother could never have imagined. The apartments became her stage for daily performances. When Lametz visited, she greeted him with apparent delight, making his arrival seem like the highlight of her day. She learned his preferences, moods, and vanities, adjusting her performance accordingly. After their physical encounters, she listened to his business complaints and fears about aging, becoming his confidante as well as his mistress. Yet beneath this comfortable existence, Jeanne felt growing restlessness. She had escaped poverty and achieved security, but remained fundamentally dependent on male desire. Her apartments, gowns, and servants could disappear if Lametz tired of her or his fortunes changed. She owned nothing, controlled nothing, existed entirely at men's pleasure. She began studying Parisian high society with new intensity, observing women who had achieved real power through strategic marriages, investments, and political connections. She noticed how some royal mistresses wielded influence extending far beyond the bedroom, shaping policy and distributing patronage. One evening, as Lametz dozed beside her, Jeanne lay awake contemplating her future. She was beautiful, clever, and increasingly skilled in seduction and manipulation. But beauty faded, and cleverness alone could not guarantee security. She needed something more, a connection to real power, a position that could not be easily revoked. She did not yet know how to achieve this transformation, but she had learned patience and the importance of recognizing opportunities when they appeared. Somewhere in Paris, she believed, existed a path to something greater than comfortable apartments and a generous protector. She simply had to find it and be ready when the moment arrived. The seeds of her greatest ambition were beginning to sprout, though she could not yet imagine they would eventually lead her to the very pinnacle of French society, and ultimately to the scaffold. Chapter 3: The Major Setback or Crisis. This chapter focuses on the catastrophic turning point in Jeanne's life, the death of King Louis XV in May 1774. After successfully maneuvering her way into the position of royal mistress through Jean-Baptiste Dubarry's schemes, including a marriage of convenience to Guillaume de Berry for noble status, Jeanne had enjoyed 5 years as the most powerful woman at Versailles. However, when the king contracts smallpox, her world begins to crumble. The church demands her removal before Louis can receive last rites, and she is forced to watch helplessly as the man who gave her everything dies beyond her reach. The new monarchs, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, despise her and immediately move to erase her from court life. Within hours of Louis XV's death, she is banished from Versailles and imprisoned at the Abbey of Pont-aux-Dames. The chapter explores the brutal swiftness with which power evaporates, and the psychological trauma of losing not just a lover, but her entire identity and security. The crisis reveals the fundamental flaw in her rise, building everything on one man's affection. Her wealth, influence, and position prove to be mirages that disappear the moment their source is removed. The chapter ends with her facing an uncertain future, stripped of protection and surrounded by enemies. The smell of vinegar and fear permeated the corridors of Versailles as servants scrubbed walls with harsh solutions and physicians whispered in hushed, frantic tones. The word smallpox crept through the palace like poison, and with it came the terrible knowledge that the King of France was dying. For Jeanne, watching from the antechamber of Louis XV's apartments, the approaching death meant more than the loss of a lover. It meant the complete destruction of the world she had so carefully constructed. The Duc d'Aiguillon approached her with the defeated expression of a man delivering a death sentence. "You must go, madame," he said quietly. "The confessor is on his way. He will not enter while you remain under this roof." Jeanne felt the words like physical blows. For 5 years she had been the most powerful woman at the French court, second only to the Queen in influence. She had shaped policy, distributed patronage, and lived in luxury that seemed infinite. Now, in a matter of hours, it was all evaporating, because the church demanded her removal as the price of the king's salvation. "Does he ask for me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Does he know I am being sent away?" "He knows what is necessary," d'Aiguillon replied. "For his salvation, Jeanne. He has agreed to renounce his relationship with you. You must leave for Rueil immediately." The betrayal cut deeper than any blade. The man who had sworn to protect her, who had defied his entire court to keep her by his side, was casting her out to save his soul. She understood the political necessity, the religious requirements, but understanding did nothing to ease the agony of abandonment. Through the closed door of the king's chamber, she could hear low moans of pain. She reached toward the wood, her hand hovering inches from the surface, then pulled back. The gesture captured the essence of her entire relationship with Louis, always reaching, never quite touching the heart of true security. The carriage ride away from Versailles was a descent into darkness. Behind her, the palace that had been her kingdom faded into the distance. Ahead lay exile, uncertainty, and the cold knowledge that she had built her life on the most unstable foundation imaginable, the affections of a mortal man. The news arrived at midnight. Louis XV was dead. Jeanne received it in silence, sitting alone in a borrowed room at the Château de Rueil. The messenger's words changed everything in an instant. The king who had loved her, protected her, and given her unimaginable power was gone, and with him died her entire existence as Madame du Barry, maîtresse en titre of France. The new monarchs made their intentions clear immediately. Louis V, weak and indecisive, was completely dominated by his wife Marie Antoinette, who had never forgiven Jeanne for her origins and influence. The young queen wanted her predecessor erased from court life entirely, and she possessed the power to make it happen. Within days, a lettre de cachet arrived, not merely banishing Jeanne from court, but imprisoning her. Her destination was the Abbey of Pont aux Dames, a grim convent where she would be held indefinitely at the pleasure of the new regime. The transition from palace to prison was swift and merciless. The convent was a world away from the gilded luxury of Versailles. Jeanne's cell was small and stark, furnished only with a narrow cot, a wooden chair, and a crucifix that seemed to judge her with cold eyes. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of bells, marking the canonical hours, and the whispered prayers of nuns who regarded her with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. She had been stripped of her servants, her finery, and her freedom. The woman who had slept in sheets of satin now lay on rough hemp. The hands that had been kissed by kings now bore the calluses of forced labor, as the nuns insisted she contribute to the community through menial work. The psychological impact was devastating. For years she had defined herself through external validation, the king's desire, the court's attention, the tangible symbols of wealth and status. Now, faced with bare stone walls and enforced solitude, she confronted the terrifying question of who she was beneath the titles and jewels. Letters from the outside world brought news of her systematic erasure. Her apartments at Versailles had been emptied, her possessions catalogued and claimed by the crown. The courtiers who had once sought her favor now pretended she had never existed. Even her name was being expunged from official records, as if the new regime could eliminate the scandal of her existence through bureaucratic revision. The friends who had benefited from her generosity and influence proved fair-weather allies. The artists she had patronized, the nobles she had helped, the servants she had treated kindly, all had melted away like morning frost at the first sign of her fall from grace. She learned the bitter truth that relationships built on power and wealth rarely survive their absence. The final humiliation arrived in the form of an official inventory of her debts and obligations. The crown demanded the return of all gifts given to her by Louis XV, including jewelry, furniture, and artworks worth hundreds of thousands of livres. The message was clear. She had been merely a custodian of these treasures, never their true owner. As she sat in her cell, reading the extensive list, Jane realized with crystalline clarity how completely she had been deceived by the illusion of ownership. The diamonds that had adorned her throat, the silk gowns that had proclaimed her status, the golden plates from which she had dined, none of it had ever truly belonged to her. She had been playing with borrowed toys, and now the real owners were reclaiming their property. The woman who had once influenced the foreign policy of Europe was now reduced to begging the Mother Superior for an extra candle to read by. The transformation was so complete, so devastating, that it seemed like a cruel fairy tale in reverse. The princess returned to her true state as a scullery maid. Yet even in the depths of despair, Jeanne's survival instincts remained sharp. She began to understand that this imprisonment, while terrible, was not necessarily permanent. Kings died, queens fell from favor, political winds shifted. If she could endure this trial, if she could maintain her sanity and health through the dark months ahead, there might yet be a chance for redemption. The crisis had stripped away everything she thought she possessed, revealing the hollow core of her former existence. But it had also freed her from the exhausting performance of being Madame du Barry. For the first time in years, she could simply be Jeanne Bécu, and perhaps in that authentic self, she might find a strength that no king could grant or revoke. The greatest test of her life had begun, and its outcome would determine whether she emerged as a survivor or became merely another cautionary tale about the dangers of reaching too high. Chapter 4. The Unraveling. Set during the French Revolution, this chapter chronicles Jeanne's final years as the world she once knew collapses around her. After her release from the convent in 1776, she had settled into comfortable retirement at her chateau in Louveciennes, living quietly on her pension and conducting a discreet relationship with the Duke of Brissac. However, the revolution transforms her from a forgotten relic of the old regime into a target of revolutionary justice. The narrative focuses on the devastating theft of her jewels in 1791, which forces her to travel to London to recover them, a journey that revolutionary authorities interpret as treasonous emigration. The emotional core of the chapter centers on the betrayal by Zemmour, the page boy she had raised and educated, who becomes radicalized and denounces her to local Jacobin committees. This personal betrayal cuts deeper than political persecution because it represents the failure of her belief that kindness and generosity could transcend class divisions. Her arrest in September 1793 marks the beginning of her final ordeal. The chapter explores her psychological deterioration as she realizes that her past as a royal mistress, which she thought safely buried, has become a death sentence in revolutionary France. The unraveling is both personal and societal, as the entire world of privilege and hierarchy collapses into chaos and bloodshed. 17 years had passed since the death of Louis XV, and Jeanne had learned to live with the ghosts of her former life. The Château de Louveciennes, a gift from the late king that she had managed to retain through careful negotiation, had become her sanctuary, a place where she could exist as simply Madame du Barry. A woman of comfortable means living in dignified retirement. The estate was beautiful in its modesty, a far cry from the overwhelming opulence of Versailles, but elegant nonetheless. She had created a life of quiet contentment, patronizing local artists, maintaining her gardens, and conducting a discreet relationship with the Duke of Brissac, who valued her for herself rather than her former influence. For the first time since her youth, she had found something approaching peace. But France was changing in ways that made such peace impossible to maintain. The revolution that had begun in 1789, with promises of liberty and equality, was growing increasingly radical. The king and queen were virtual prisoners in Paris. The nobility was fleeing the country in growing numbers, and the streets echoed with talk of justice for the people's oppressors. On that cold January morning, Jeanne's carefully constructed world shattered. She awoke to find her chateau had been robbed during the night, her most precious possessions stolen with surgical precision. The thieves had known exactly where to look, opening hidden compartments and secret caches with the expertise of those who had been given detailed information. They took everything, her steward reported, his face pale with shock. The diamond necklaces, the sapphire set, the pearl bracelets, all the pieces His late Majesty gave you. They left only the lesser items, as if they knew precisely what was most valuable. Jeanne stared at the empty jewelry cases, her hands trembling. These pieces were not merely valuable objects. They were the tangible proof of her extraordinary life, the physical evidence that she had once been loved by the most powerful man in Europe. Without them, she felt diminished, as if part of her identity had been carved away. The investigation revealed the devastating truth. The theft had been orchestrated by someone with intimate knowledge of her household. Suspicion fell immediately on Zamore, the Bengali page boy she had taken in as a child and raised almost as a son. He had been absent from the chateau on the night of the robbery, and his behavior had become increasingly strange and hostile in recent months. Desperation drove Jeanne to make a fatal decision. Unable to accept the loss of her treasures, she traveled to London in pursuit of the thieves, believing she could recover her stolen property through English contacts. The journey was legal. She had obtained proper documentation, but in the fevered atmosphere of revolutionary France, any travel abroad was viewed with suspicion. London received her as a celebrity, a living relic of the scandalous court of Louis XV. English society, always fascinated by French decadence, welcomed her into their salons and drawing rooms. She was wined and dined, interviewed by curious aristocrats, and treated as an exotic curiosity from a vanished world. But her mission was unsuccessful. The stolen jewels had vanished into the shadowy networks of international gem trading, and her efforts to trace them only drew unwanted attention. Revolutionary agents in London noted her presence, her meetings with French migrants, and her apparent comfort among enemies of the Republic. When she finally returned to France in April 1792, she found a country transformed. The monarchy had been abolished, the king was imprisoned, and the revolution had entered its most radical phase. Her travels to London, innocent though they were, had been reinterpreted as treasonous activities in support of counter-revolutionary forces. September 1793, the final betrayal. The knock on her door came at dawn, accompanied by the sound of military boots on her garden path. National Guardsmen surrounded the chateau, their faces hard with revolutionary fervor. Leading them was a local official who had once been a servant at Versailles and remembered the arrogance of the old regime. But the cruelest blow came when she saw Zamore among them, wearing a tricolor cockade and carrying a denunciation he had written against her. The young man she had dressed in silk, educated in literature and languages, and treated as family now stood as her accuser. Citizen Baku, the official announced, using her birth name to emphasize her fall from grace, you are accused of correspondence with enemies of the Republic, of sending aid to migrants, and of hoarding wealth that belongs to the people. Jeanne looked at Zamore, searching his face for some sign of the affection they had once shared. Tell them who I am, she pleaded. Tell them how I cared for you, how I gave you opportunities no one else would have. Zamore's response was cold, rehearsed, poisoned by revolutionary ideology. You were a master, I was property. The Republic recognizes no masters. Your kindness was manipulation. Your generosity was theft from the people. The words struck her like physical blows. She had believed that personal relationships transcended politics, that kindness created genuine loyalty. The betrayal revealed the naive romanticism of this belief. In revolutionary France, class identity trumped personal history. As they bound her hands and led her toward the waiting cart, Jeanne looked back at Louveciennes one final time. The chateau that had been her refuge, her attempt to create a life beyond the scandals of her past, was being sealed and inventoried. Everything she had built since her fall from royal favor was crumbling just as completely as her original rise had collapsed. The prison was a world away from both the luxury of Versailles and the quiet comfort of Louveciennes. Jeanne found herself crammed into a cell with other women awaiting trial, former duchesses, merchants' wives, anyone deemed an enemy of the people. The conditions were appalling: straw mattresses, watery soup, the constant stench of unwashed bodies and fear. Her fellow prisoners included women whose stories mirrored her own in their tragic irony. A duchess who had given generously to the poor now stood accused of hoarding wealth. A merchant's wife who had supported revolutionary ideals in their early days was condemned for her bourgeois origins. The revolution was devouring its children as well as its enemies. Jeanne's interrogations were brutal and relentless. The prosecutors were less interested in truth than in creating a narrative that fit their ideological requirements. They wanted her to confess to being a symbol of aristocratic corruption, a woman who had lived in obscene luxury while the people starved. "You bathed in milk while children had none to drink," one prosecutor accused. "I bathed in water like everyone else," she replied. But the truth was irrelevant. They needed villains for their morality play, and she was perfectly cast for the role. The psychological unraveling was complete. The woman who had once influenced the foreign policy of Europe was now reduced to begging for clean straw and an extra bowl of soup. The jewels she had lost seemed trivial compared to the loss of her dignity, her freedom, and her hope. As autumn turned to winter, the sound of the guillotine's daily work echoed through Paris like a mechanical heartbeat. Each day brought new names to the lists of the condemned, and Jeanne knew with growing certainty that her own name would soon be among them. The unraveling that had begun with her exile from Versailles was finally complete. The girl from Vaucouleurs, who had climbed to unimaginable heights, was about to discover the ultimate price of her extraordinary journey. Chapter 5. Resolution and Final Reflection. The final chapter presents Jeanne's trial and execution during the height of the Terror in December 1793. Unlike many aristocrats who face death with stoic dignity, Jeanne's final moments are marked by raw, desperate terror that humanizes her completely. Her trial before the Revolutionary Tribunal is a foregone conclusion. She is condemned, not for specific crimes, but as a symbol of the corruption and excess of the old regime. The narrative focuses on her last day, December 8, 1793, as she is taken from the Conciergerie prison to the Place de la Révolution. Her complete breakdown during the execution, historically documented in her plea, "You are going to hurt me. Please don't hurt me," becomes not a sign of weakness but the most authentic moment of her life. Stripped of all pretense, she faces death as simply a human being who loves life and fears its loss. The chapter concludes with reflection on the tragic irony of her story, a woman who sought security through wealth and power, only to discover that such foundations are ultimately illusory. Her legacy becomes a cautionary tale about the price of ambition and the fragility of human happiness. The narrative ends with the recognition that in her final moments of terror, Jeanne achieved a kind of honesty that had eluded her throughout her extraordinary but ultimately tragic life. December 8, 1793, Sunday Conciergerie Prison to Place de la Révolution, Paris. The dawn that greeted Jean's final day was gray and bitter, with frost covering the stones of the conciergerie courtyard like tears frozen in time. She had not slept during her last night on earth, listening instead to the sounds of Paris awakening, church bells marking the hours, cartwheels on cobblestones, the distant murmur of crowds already gathering at the Place de la Révolution for the day's entertainment. At 50 years old, Jeanne faced death with none of the philosophical resignation that had marked the final hours of other aristocrats. She possessed no noble tradition of stoic acceptance, no religious faith to comfort her, no political ideology to justify her sacrifice. She was simply a woman who had lived fully and desperately wanted to continue living. The trial before the Revolutionary Tribunal had been swift and predetermined. Public prosecutor Fouquier Tinville had recited her crimes with mechanical precision: correspondence with enemies of the Republic, hoarding wealth that belonged to the people, corrupting the monarchy through her influence. The evidence was largely circumstantial, the witnesses unreliable, but guilt or innocence was irrelevant. She represented the excess and corruption of the old regime, and the revolution demanded symbolic victims. "I have committed no crimes against the people," she had declared during her defense. "I was a woman who loved a king, and he rewarded that love with gifts. I never harmed anyone, never took bread from children's mouths, never conspired against France." But her words fell on deaf ears. The judges saw not an individual woman, but an emblem of everything they sought to destroy: her beauty, her wealth, her extraordinary rise from prostitute to royal mistress. All of it made her the perfect scapegoat for a revolution hungry for villains. Now, as the turnkey approached her cell with the traditional white chemise worn by the condemned, Jeanne felt terror unlike anything she had experienced. She had faced poverty, exile, imprisonment, and humiliation, but death was different. Death was final, absolute, beyond negotiation or charm. "Please," she whispered to the prison chaplain who offered last rites, "tell them I will give anything. I have more jewels hidden, more information about migrants. I can be useful to the Republic." The priest looked at her with pity. "It is too late for bargaining, my child. Make your peace with God." But Jeanne had never learned to make peace with powerlessness. All her life she had found ways to negotiate, to charm, to survive through wit and beauty. The concept of a situation beyond her ability to influence was foreign to her nature. The journey to the scaffold began at 11 o'clock. The tumbril that carried her through the streets of Paris was the same cart that had transported Marie Antoinette just weeks before. But where the queen had maintained icy dignity, Jeanne collapsed into uncontrolled panic. She screamed, begged the crowds for mercy, pleaded with her guards to spare her life. "I don't want to die," she cried, her voice carrying over the jeers and shouts of the spectators. "Please, I beg you, have mercy. I am not ready." The crowd, accustomed to silent dignity from their victims, was shocked by this raw display of terror. Some were moved to pity, others to contempt, but none could ignore the desperate humanity of her plea. This was not a symbol or a political statement. This was a woman facing extinction and fighting it with every fiber of her being. As the cart approached the Place de la Révolution, Jeanne could see the guillotine rising from the center of the square like an altar to mechanized death. The blade caught the weak winter sunlight, and she began to hyperventilate, her breathing coming in short, sharp gasps. "One more moment," she screamed as they dragged her from the cart. "Please, just one more moment. Life is so sweet." The executioner, Sanson, who had known her during her days of glory, looked pained by her suffering. He tried to hurry the process, to spare her the prolonged agony, but Jeanne fought every step. Her legs gave way, and they had to carry her up the scaffold steps. "You are going to hurt me," she sobbed as they positioned her on the plank. "Please don't hurt me." These words, recorded by witnesses and preserved in history, became her final legacy, not a statement of defiance or acceptance, but a simple human plea for compassion in the face of mechanized brutality. The blade fell at 11:25 a.m., ending the extraordinary life of Jeanne Bécu, who had risen from the gutters of Vaucouleurs to the pinnacle of French society and fallen to the scaffold of revolutionary justice. Her head was displayed to the crowd, which responded with unusual silence. Her terror had reminded them uncomfortably of their own mortality. Final reflection. In death, Jeanne du Barry achieved something that had eluded her in life: complete honesty. Stripped of titles, wealth, and pretense, she faced her final moment as purely human, afraid, desperate, clinging to existence with the same fierce determination that had driven her extraordinary rise. Her story serves as a meditation on the nature of security and the price of ambition. She had sought safety in wealth, protection in power, and permanence in the affections of a king. All of these proved illusory. The diamonds could be stolen, the power could evaporate, and the king could die. Only in her final moments, when all artifice was stripped away, did she reveal the authentic self that had been hidden beneath layers of performance and calculation. The tragedy of Madame du Barry lies not in her death, which was shared by thousands during the Terror, but in the recognition that her entire extraordinary life had been built on foundations of sand. She climbed higher than any woman of her origins had a right to expect, only to discover that the summit was a precipice. Yet there is something admirable in her refusal to go gently into that good night. Her final screams of protest against death represented the same life force that had driven her from flower seller to royal mistress. In choosing to fight rather than submit, she remained true to the survival instincts that had defined her from birth. History remembers Madame du Barry as a scandalous figure, a symbol of aristocratic decadence, a cautionary tale about the dangers of reaching too high. But perhaps she should be remembered more simply as a woman who loved life passionately, lived it fully, and refused to surrender it without a fight. In a world that demanded women be either saints or sinners, she was simply, completely, tragically human. The scaffold claimed her body, but her final cry, "You are going to hurt me," echoes through history as a reminder that behind every symbol, every scandal, every rise and fall, there beats a human heart that values its own existence above all else. In the end, that may be the most honest thing any of us can say.